Hey folks, welcome to week 11 of Visual Design. How is everybody? I hope you are staying safe, being well, and trying to have a little bit of fun while we are all getting through the current situation. All right, so Visual Design, week 11, what are we doing? Well, we've been playing around with Adobe Illustrator. We have covered shapes, we have covered anchor points, we have covered wires, we have covered fills and strokes and how to merge shapes together and intersect shapes. So hopefully you have been diving in deep into Illustrator and playing around with all sorts of shapes, from squares to rectangles to circles to ellipses to stars and so on and so forth. So this week we are going to start doing some drawing with Illustrator, some more freehand drawing, and we're going to take a look at things like the pen tool and the pencil tool and a few other related elements. So let's take a look at the syllabus. So we'll hop over here to the syllabus, week 11. Normally we would have met April 9th and 7th, 7th and 9th. But of course we are working online here. I hope everybody is doing a good job keeping up and making time to practice with their software as they would have anyway. Remember what I told you? Learning software is like practicing an instrument. You've got to make time to do it or you will only be average at it. And you want to get better at it. Hopefully having some fun with Illustrator. One thing I've noticed in teaching this software for 20 years now is that some students really gravitate towards the pixel-based Photoshop and other students really love the vector-based Illustrator, and there seems to be a bit of a bifurcation between the two. So I'm not sure which side you are on, but let me know how you like an Illustrator, and I'd be curious to hear back from you. Okay, so this week we are doing drawing in Illustrator, which of course is different than handling shapes. We always start with shapes like we did the last couple of weeks because it's easy to understand shapes. We're all familiar with basic shapes, and so if you understand how to create and edit those and then build them into other sorts of constructions like the snowman we worked on last time, then your imagination can start kicking in and thinking, oh, I can make things with shapes. But sometimes you want to be able to just sort of draw in Illustrator. Now, what's interesting is that freehand artwork also happens in Adobe Photoshop, but of course there we call it digital painting because pixels are manipulated in a way that is more similar to paint. In Illustrator, because it's all about lines and shapes and anchor points and wireframes, it's more similar to drawing, somewhat like technical drawing because of its nature, but still drawing nonetheless. And so there are specific tools in Illustrator that lend themselves to drawing, and so we're going to take specific time to look at the pen tool and the pencil tool, and we're going to do some practice on that and talk about how that works. We're also going to look at the selection tool as well as revisit the direct selection tool, which is the white arrow that we looked at last time, because it indeed has some use here as well. Meanwhile, in the background, you guys should be working on the project number 2, Pieces, Parts, Pieces, where you're taking that really simple house that I gave you and are tricking it out to a more advanced house. Remember, that is due next week in week 12, so you still have plenty of time to work on it. If you are struggling with it, if you're getting stuck, if you need some help, certainly be sure to contact me and I can help you out with that. Okay, so let's take a look at what is in the week 11 folder, because there's some stuff in there we're going to need. So in the under files in Canvas in the week 11 folder, you're going to find this handout here, which is Drawing Basics, and you're going to find a folder that says Practice Images, which are these 3 images here. We're going to be using those. I'm also going to be demonstrating some stuff on Illustrator. Now, the Drawing Basics handout is this one here, and you'll see that there are a number of links. The first 3 are directly from Adobe, the Get to Know the Drawing Tools, Drawing Lines with the Pencil, and Start Creating with the Pen tool. So above and beyond what I am going to show you in my little demonstration, certainly check out these demonstrations. Also, this is a great YouTube video, Pen Tool Basics. You can see here, this is the first one, Get to Know the Drawing Tools. From Illustrator. You can certainly watch and play along with this one. It's a really quick lesson, which is super helpful. The Draw Smooth Lines and Shapes with the Pencil tool. Getting to know the Pen tool here, Start Creating with the Pen tool. Shows you how to make some basic shapes, including this funky alien. And then lastly, that YouTube video that I mentioned, which is Adobe Illustrator Pen Tool Basics. So certainly When you're done going through my demonstration, check out this handout and practice with all of these. As you can see here in this example image, you can do some really elaborate drawing and illustration in Illustrator, and as you can see by all these open tools and palettes, there are a number of tools and palettes available that can help you create things like this sort of tree creature that's going on here. But of course, you've got to start somewhere with some basic shapes and some basic drawing skills. So we're going to do that. We'll get back to those demo images, these practice images, in a little bit. But first, let's take a look at Illustrator. Okay, so I'm going to hop over here to Illustrator. And I just have a basic document set up. This is just a 16 by 9 inch document. You can open up any size you want. I have the ruler activated as well as the grid, because the grid really comes in handy when you are drawing in Illustrator, specifically the pen tool, but we'll take a look at all of them. Okay, so over to our toolbox. Remember, you always start out with the black selection arrow. That is your default tool. Always start with that tool, always go back to that tool. It's a great rule of thumb in Illustrator. And then 2 tools down below the selection arrow is the pen tool. Now it does look like one of those metal nib pens, the kind you would dip into ink, which I'm sure very few of you, if not none of you, have ever used because they're pretty outdated. But the icon for the pen tool has remained this little metal nib pen forever. We did look at the pen tool last week when we were looking at the add anchor point and the delete anchor point tool, when we were changing some basic shapes into some more interesting shapes. So you should be familiar with this, but again, we use the add anchor and the delete anchor. Today we're going to use the actual pen tool. So that's one of the tools we're going to use. And then the other tool we're going to use is the pencil tool, which you can find a couple spots below the pen tool. So below the pen tool is the type tool, skip that, then the rectangle shape tool, which we've already worked with, so skip that. And then right below that, you're going to find a little collection of tools that starts with, if you hold it down, there's a shaper tool, a pencil tool, a smooth tool, a path eraser tool, and a join tool. All of these are drawing tools. We're not going to get to all of these today, but you're certainly encouraged to play around with them and see what they do. So we're going to work with just the regular pencil tool, and then we'll go back and play around with the smooth tool too. Okay, so pencil tool, how does it work? Well, you choose the pencil tool, and if you double click on the pencil tool once it is chosen, you'll see that you get some pencil tool options. And the first slider is what's called the fidelity slider, meaning how accurate or smooth do you want the line to be in relation to the line you're actually drawing. Now, I am drawing in this demonstration with the trackpad on my laptop. You might be drawing with a mouse. Neither of those options, mice or trackpads, are really designed for good drawing on screen. A mouse is like drawing with a bar of soap, and a trackpad is only as accurate as the tip of your finger can be. All right, and some other options available here in the pen tool options menu is to fill new pencil strokes, meaning that as you draw, it will automatically fill it with a color. I usually leave that unchecked, and I'll show you how that relates to the color picker in a second. Keep selected, which means that it remains active as you're drawing it. That's always a good idea to keep it on. And then, of course, there's some other ones that you can sort of play around with, but for the most part, I usually leave it at its default settings, but I just wanted to show you how you can get to it in case you want to play around with it. Okay, so we'll hit OK. Now we have the pencil tool. You can see that our tool tip here looks like a little pencil. And I am actually going to first zoom in a little bit just so we can get a better view of what's going on as I'm doing it. Go back to the pencil tool here. And then before we start drawing, we want to take a look at the color picker. Now, if there is a color in the fill, it will start to fill in the shape as you're drawing it. It makes more sense to keep this empty. So with the fill color on top, go down to that universal symbol for none and click that so you have no fill stroke. Now the color of the stroke is really what's important because you're going to see that, and you can make it whatever color you want, but just so you guys can see it more easily, I'm going to make it sort of this bright pink color here, which is maybe not the color I would normally draw in, but I think it just sort of comes in handy visually. Okay, so how do you draw? Well, it's easy. You push down with your mouse button, click, and just start to freehand draw. and you can draw whatever the heck you want, just some sort of a morphic shape. Now, you don't have to close the shape when you are drawing with the pencil tool. When you let go of the mouse button, boom, it locks into place. You'll notice that the curves look a lot smoother as soon as I let go of the mouse button than they actually were when I was drawing them. And that has to do with this part of the pencil tool options, from accurate to smooth. So the default stage is in the middle. Now, if I were to slide this all the way to accurate and then draw something with the pencil tool, you would see that it pretty much does an exact replica of what I drew, but it's not very smooth looking. It's got all the bumps that I managed to put in there. And then meanwhile, if I were to change the options to go fully in the other direction from on the fidelity, make that completely smooth, then if I were to draw something and really kind of, make it very jerky like that, and then let go, you'll see that it really smoothed it out a lot, but it doesn't look exactly like what I drew. So you need to sort of find the balance of what you like. So that's why I generally leave it at the default setting, which is sort of in the middle. Now, let's talk about, once you've drawn something, how it's treated. So of course, like I told you before, once you're done doing something, go back to the black selection arrow. And now, of course, I can choose the line that I drew. It is still treated like an object. You'll see that when I choose it, it gets a bounding box. And just like everything with bounding boxes, I can resize it. I can squish it. Right? If I hold down the shift key, I can make it smaller or larger, but keep the proportions the same. So that works out nicely. I can rotate it just like you can any object. Spin that puppy around. And of course, I can squish it using the anchor points on the side or the anchor points on the top. And you'll notice that, let me enlarge it so we can see it better. With it selected, if I hold down the Option key while it's selected, a whole bunch of controls pop up. So every anchor that was created while I drew it appears, as well as some rounding balls, which we've played with before in terms of different shapes like the square or the rectangle. Now I'm keeping the Option key, I'm sorry, the Command key down while I'm doing this. Which if you're on a PC, you want to do the Control key, Mac, the Command key. And the reason why the anchor points happen is every time as you're drawing freehand that Illustrator senses that you're slightly changing direction with your drawing, it will drop an anchor point, kind of like dropping a pin into a pegboard, right? And then it will continue along. So you'll notice that every time it changes direction, a new anchor happens. And then similarly, if you have a sharp looking edge or a tight looking curve, it will give you these rounding balls, which allows you to change the way in which that works. So I can round out that corner, I can make that more pointy, I can make this one more round. So these are sort of adjustments. Okay, now if you, with your black selection arrow chosen, simply click away from your line, it deactivates it, just like a shape, right? And if you click on it again, it reactivates it. You can also lasso it by clicking and dragging a lasso around it, and that'll reactivate it. Now you're probably wondering, what does this blob look like if I fill it with a color? Well, pencil drawings, because they're generally loose like this, don't fill particularly well with color, because you can see the starting point is over here. The end point is over here, and they don't connect, and they do a lot of overlapping. But just so you can see what happens, I'm going to swap the fill with the stroke, so I'm going to make the fill color the same as the stroke. Flip that, and you can see what happens. So it's not really a finished shape, so the pencil tool is better for simply drawing lines. Although if you're trying to replicate a Picasso drawing, then this might be the way to go, because it is a lovely piece of abstract art. But really beyond that, it's not great as a filled object, so you can sort of convert it to just a line and treat it like this. Now, again, if you deselect it from the black selection arrow and it's inactive, but I go over here to the white direct selection arrow, which we've worked with before, you can see that as I hover along the path or the line, certain anchor points pop up. So in this way, the direct selection tool works just like it does with the shapes, allowing you to grab anchor points and move them around and completely change the line that you have drawn. Now you'll probably notice that as I grab certain anchor points, these little fly-out handles happen, and in fact they're called handles. And if you grab the tips of those, that allows you to change the nature of the actual curve, the way that works as you're moving it around. And if you grab just one of the handles, you'll see that both of them don't necessarily respond. If they do both respond, like this is happening here, you can simply hold down the Option key, grab one of the handles, and now it will work independently. So this gives you a bunch of options, and you can really sort of fine-tune what's going on with your line here. You can see that I can really fine-tune it however I want. Okay, and similar to every other object, if you go back to your black selection arrow, turn on the bounding box, and then if you don't want your object anymore, simply hit the delete key. It will go away. So great, that is the pencil tool. What else do you need to know about the pencil tool? Well, as you are drawing, I generally go with the default line weight or the stroke weight, and we'll get into that in a moment over here with the stroke palette. So if you sort of just draw something and then let it go, there you go, it has its sort of default stroke weight. But once you've drawn it, if you open up the stroke palette, which is over here, you can see that you can change the weight of the stroke just like you could around a shape. So this allows me to thicken the stroke and make it fatter or thinner. I'm going to make it really big so we can really see it. Also, I can change the cap so that the end of the stroke, you can see here, it's a flat blunt cap, but I can make it round by clicking this button. So now the stroke is rounded. Same thing with the corners. You can see that as it takes a corner here, it's a sharp corner. But if I go down here to corners, I can hit the round one, and you can see now that they round off. If I wanted to turn this stroke into a dashed line, I can click this and it becomes a dashed line. And I do, of course, have to adjust the size of the dash and the gaps. So we can make the dashes 5 points and the gaps, say 10 points, or better yet, 5 points and 20 points. And now we have an actual dotted line, so you can play around with that. And then if you don't want it to be a dashed line, simply uncheck it. And then the other thing you can do is you can add arrowheads. Now, I mentioned these when we were talking about shapes, but they don't really work with shapes, but they work great with lines. So this is the beginning of our stroke. This is the end of our stroke. So if we grab the first set, you can see there's a bunch of arrowheads to choose from. And even though they say arrowheads, they're not all arrowheads. Some of them are arrow tails. Some of them are symbols, but you can try those out. So you can add an arrowhead like that. And if I want to add another one, I can add that one there. Now they don't look very good because it's a squiggly line, but I can also change the scale of the arrowhead by bringing down the size of them like this. You know, those are pretty big. So I can make smaller ones so that it makes more sense for the line. There we go. And of course you can reverse them if you would like. You can also change the nature of the stroke. This is a uniform line, as you can see down here under profile, but if I want to change the design of the line, I can do that. So it becomes thick and thin, right? Or pick some other ones and they change that around. All right, so that is the pencil tool along with the stroke palette. So take some time, play around with the pencil tool, and then in the next online lecture a little later this week, we're going to dive into the pen tool and we'll talk about our practice images.